Okay, welcome back everybody. So before the break we were talking about using the levels tool to be able to modify, to have greater control over the contrast within an image. But there's also another tool as well that we can use to modify the contrast of an image, and that is the curves as well. So both of these tools are available under the image menu, adjustments, levels, or curves. And you could actually use something like auto levels, auto contrast, auto color. But I recommend that you actually avoid those for the most part and do it manually, because almost all of the time you will get better results if you fine-tune by yourself rather than use the auto tools. So the curves is sort of a similar idea. It's just a different way of presenting this same amount of information, though what happens in this case is that you have arguably even finer grained control over what happens to the surrounding bits of information from that black point, from that white point, and from that sort of middle gray. So if you recall that we had those three sliders, the black point was the one on the far left where you could adjust which is the black, and the other two correspond to whatever they sound like. So using curves, what we can do is actually modify, again, the contrast or even the brightness of a particular image. And you'll notice that we have basically a straight line, a straight diagonal line that goes from an input of black to an output of black all the way through an input of white to an output of white. So you'll notice that along these two axes we have two different things, basically two pieces of information. So we have here the input, so basically the data as it's coming from the file. So whatever the file says is a value of 0, black is right here. Whatever it says is value of 128 or about mid-range is right here. Whatever is 256 is over there. And what the output refers to is what we're actually seeing on the screen. So in this case, this is something that's going to be completely black on the screen. This is something that's going to be a middle gray on the screen. And the very top is going to be something that's very white on the screen. And so if you modify this, let's say that we bump the curve up slightly, you'll notice that it makes things generally brighter. And that makes sense because now what used to be this middle gray right here is now up here. So right here, the input level, where the input used to be this sort of middle gray, in the file that actually says it's a middle gray, it mapped correspondingly to the output of being this middle gray. So what is actually displayed on the screen was a middle gray. But as soon as we bumped it up, then what happens is that this middle gray that used to be right here in the middle is now a little bit higher. So it is now some number of values higher than what it used to be. And in fact, we get to see exactly what it is. So what used to be a value of 115 is now a value of 151. So what used to be just slightly darker than middle gray is now slightly brighter than middle gray. And you can actually create multiple points. And so one of the best ways to increase the contrast is to bump up the highlights a little bit. So just something like this. You don't want to overdo it again, otherwise you'll get some really crazy colors. And then you can bring down the shadows a little bit. And having a more vertical line here means that this will be contrastier. You'll get a little bit more contrast available within the image. And the reason for that is that what used to be, so this level of gray, this sort of, it's about a quarter of the way in, is now considerably darker. So what used to be dark is now darker, and what used to be bright is now brighter. So we're just increasing the apparent contrast within this particular image. And we could really go all out and crazy and really make the contrast really quite high. But you can see that this makes it really quite ugly. But what we've done is really increased the contrast. And in fact, we can look at this and think about what this is doing intelligently. So here we have all the way up until almost middle gray. All of this information is now being thrown away. We're calling it black now. And then all of this information in the middle is what is most important for all of this range of colors. And then very quickly up here, about a quarter of the way before absolute white, we are now saying that it is going to be this sort of pure white that exists within the image. So we get this very harsh, overly contrasted image within a particular, or within this particular photo. Now, I realized that one of the downfalls to using this is that you could have actually modified this photo using those sliders in the Adobe Camera Raw or other RAW formats or other RAW software to actually increase the contrast if you really wanted it to look this cartoonish. However, using these tools brings us to something else that we get to do with Photoshop as well. In fact, so increasing the contrast, I do want to mention as an aside, if you increase it too much, something that didn't have a lot of noise could suddenly have a lot more noise within it. And it's sort of kind of hard to tell on the projector. And again, I apologize for that. But you can see in particularly these sort of middle gray regions where we now have a lot more noise within the image where previously we just had none. So that's another pitfall to using this. However, using the raw file type, because we had a lot more available data to us, we don't see a lot of other artifacts besides these sort of crazy colors and maybe enhanced noise. We would see some additional color artifacts as well if we try to do a similar thing in the JPEG file format. Now, keep all of this in mind because I need to actually switch gears a little bit and talk about another portion of Photoshop before I can tie this in together again. So I want to direct your attention to the lower right-hand portion over here, or this little box over here that says layers at the top. And so those of you that have used Photoshop before are probably familiar with layers, the layer concept. But for those of you that aren't, just imagine that you have some particular layer like this background, for example, and it's just this white piece of paper. So it could be something like this, but imagine that it's all white, or not in this case, but let's say that I created a new file, just any old file here, and now you'll see that the layer for that, this background layer, is all white. And if I were to create some doodle on this particular layer, so I'll just do something crazy like this. All right, just anything just to represent a doodle on there. Now you'll notice that it is as if I had drawn on this white sheet of paper. Okay, it's just like you would expect when you're actually modifying a particular image. You're actually modifying the pixels of that image. However, if I create an additional layer, and you'll notice that there's sort of it looks like a new page, a folded over page icon. If I click that, I create a new layer on top. And you can think of this as essentially a piece of transparency or a piece of like cellophane that's now on top of this sheet of paper with the doodle. So now I can continue doodling on that layer. So I'll change the color of the brush here to a blue, or to a cyan, I guess. And then I'll just make some lines here to represent another doodle. Now, traditionally, you might think, okay, well now I've actually just drawn over that black doodle, but because I've drawn it on a new layer, which if you think of again as a piece of transparency on top, that means that I can treat each of these independently of each other. So if I had these two sheets and I remove the first doodle, then I would see only that cyan that cyan doodle that I created, and that's exactly what you see here. Or if I recreated that original image and then I moved that piece of transparency away, now what I would see is the original doodle that existed on that white sheet of paper. And so this is a relatively simple concept, but it is really important to us as Photoshoppers to be able to use these layers to their full effectiveness. Now, in order to show or hide a layer, you have to modify. You just click on this little eye icon that's next to the layer, and if you click on that, then it makes that one layer disappear, so I can click to show it or click to hide it. And this actually becomes very, very useful. And so modifying these layers can actually be a pretty fun thing. So in addition to just being able to create a new layer, you could also add some particular effects to one layer individually. So you'll notice that here I have a whole bunch of options available to me. And this is the sort of thing that's really fun to play with at home, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but I could do, for example, a drop shadow on this top layer. And now, whereas before I just had these cyan lines, now I just have this sort of shadow 3D effect on it. So I can just very easily add some neat and useless effects to a particular layer. But this is great if you're into more digital painting than perhaps this photo manipulation, where these effects perhaps are not quite as useful. Okay, so to take another step towards tying these tools all together is that we can use a layer to be able to manipulate other layers underneath it. So as you can see, we've already sort of done that here. By drawing these cyan lines on top of my black doodle, you can see that I've already altered, how that black doodle appears. But let's say that I had something much more complex than just this doodle. Let's say that I had an image like this, where I only want to modify a specific portion of the image and not the entire thing. So whereas before, what we did when we were modifying the levels or the curves, we were modifying it for the entire image, we can now use layers to try to manipulate only a certain aspect of that image. And there is something special, a special type of layer. So here I'm just going to undo our fancy curves. Let's see, where's the history? Oh no, where did history go? Here it is, open. All right, so this is what our original image looked like. Now let's say that I just wanted to modify a specific region of the curves, or to put it another way, what's even more important about this is that if you remember from having this layer concept, I could modify each layer independently. That means that when I modified this top layer, I didn't have to touch the bottom layer. I wasn't actually modifying the data that existed in that bottom layer. And that's really important when we want to be able to go back and make some further changes to maybe one of these other layers. As you manipulate these photos and as they become more complex, you really will want to go back and modify something a few steps earlier. So if we create a special type of layer called an adjustment layer, and by going to the layer menu, new adjustment layer, you see that we have a lot of the same options that we had in that adjustments menu that we were talking about a little bit earlier. Most specifically, the first two are levels and curves. So I can actually create a new adjustment layer that modifies the levels or the curves without actually modifying the layer underneath it. And so let me show you what I mean by that. I'll go to curves again, and it's just giving me some information. It'll let me name the layer if I want to be able to organize it nicely. The rest you can pretty much leave alone. It's not going to be very important to us right now. So I hit OK, and then I'll be able to increase the contrast to that same ridiculous amount that I did before. Now click OK. Now it looks exactly the same as it did when we did this with just the levels tool before. But what's really neat is that you'll notice that down here in the layers palette, I have a new layer called curves. And it is modifying the layer underneath it. In fact, if you see the little icon right here, this looks like our original image. And in fact, if we hide this adjustment layer, we get that original image back. We see that it is still hidden underneath this adjustments layer. So we don't actually have to modify that one particular layer. And so this is where Photoshop's editing power really becomes apparent, is that now you can make these changes. And so if I wanted to make a change to the original image, and let's say that maybe I want to produce two versions of this image. One version that I want to have really ridiculous colors for, and another one where I just want to have mellow, more neutral colors. If I want to make a modification to this particular image, I can still make the modification here. So I could still do something, I'm just going to do something obnoxious like a doodle again, so just another cyan doodle here. Now if I actually click on that, if I reappear that curves, then that modification still occurs within the curves, but I've made that modification to the original image. Now, what's really neat about this stuff, if we take it a step further than this, is that we can tell the layer to apply to only a specific portion of the image. So right now it's being applied everywhere on this particular image. But let's say that I only wanted this ridiculous color maybe in this right half of the image, or maybe above this mountaintop, for example. Is there some way that I could modify that? And that is exactly what this little white box directly to the right of this adjustment layer icon is. This is called a mask. And using this mask, you can define which portions of that layer appear and which portions do not appear. So you have even finer grained control over the modifications that you can make to your image. And so another way to think of this mask is a way of defining transparency for that particular layer. So you'll notice that right now it is all white. And it is actually really important for me to note that if you're going to make a modification to a layer, you must click on that layer in this layers palette. So if I wanted to make the modification to the background, I have to click on the background or the curves layer. And that may sound obvious, but trust me, when you're making modifications and you realize that it's on the wrong layer or it's not behaving like you want it to, this is something that's very important to check, is that you're modifying the correct layer available. Okay, now one of the ways we can modify this particular mask is just to click it. And then we can actually use a brush. So over here, so along this confusing list of tools on the left side, one of them is a brush tool, and it just looks like a brush. And so eventually you might learn some of these keyboard shortcuts. You notice that for a second it said in parentheses, it's a brush tool, and in parentheses it's the letter B. Eventually you might learn some of these shortcuts, but for now we'll just click on it. And then down here we define the color of the brush. So we have a foreground color and a background color. For now I'm going to use these little arrows to swap them, so that now the black is the foreground color. So this means that using the brush tool, I'm just going to brush black onto something, any layer that I select. So now by clicking on this curves, and I should make the brush a little bit bigger, a lot bit bigger. All right, then I can actually modify specific portions of this image. And you might look at it, you might say that, well, I'm just making it a lot grayer, but that's how the original photo appeared. This was the original photo. This is the modified photo. But by using this mask, I can actually erase, so to speak, although I'm not really erasing, I can erase portions of this adjustment layer and modify it that way. Now you can actually view the adjustment layer and see your handiwork directly, so that you don't have to see how it's actually impacting it. You can view the layer directly by Alt clicking. So if you're on a Mac, it's the Option key. If you're on Windows, I believe it's the Alt key. It might be one of those keys down there. Just try them all if the Alt one doesn't work. You can, when you Alt click on that, you will actually see the mask. So this is the painting that I did. It's very pretty, yes, but it's sort of an amorphous black blob that defines this mask. So whatever is black here means that the bottom layer is going to shine through. Whatever is white means that my current layer is going to it's going to be valid. So the adjustment that I made here will be valid everywhere that this mask is white, and it will be invalid, or it will allow the bottom layers to shine through unscathed, unmodified, through this black region here. Now the beauty of this is that it is not strictly black and white. You do have layers of gray available to you as well. And in fact, if I zoom in, you can see that it gets sort of soft here. There's these gray tones that exist here, and you can use this to define a sort of a softer version or a less absolute form of this particular mask. And so you can use this mask to make it much, much softer. And using this, you can actually do it. So I'm not going to do the work now because I actually have already done the work elsewhere. You can use something like this to try to remove some particular image. Let's see. Okay, so here, this is embarrassing because apparently I used a different method altogether. What I attempted when I had this original image, and if you remember, this is just a processed image that I opened elsewhere, and in the original image, if you ignore the doodle and the blob and the extra colors, it was that I had this annoying power line right through the image. And so one of the ways that I tried to change it was to use this concept of adjustment layers, so that you'll notice that I modified the brightness and the contrast of the image, made it a little bit brighter through that specific region of the image where it was actually made darker, and then used a mask here, and I'll zoom in on this, and you can see that I used the mask to try to define exactly where I wanted the brightness to be modified. Now, in the end, I have to admit that this didn't work out like I wanted it to, because it was very hard to get the edges of this sort of black line to look natural. It usually would get some sort of a halo effect, so I had to actually abort that particular mission and use an entirely different means of doing it, which I don't think we're going to go over today, but it's basically a way of just erasing things. So you can use this same technique. It's a clone stamp tool, and you can use it to erase all sorts of things. X's, or people or things that you don't want in an image or what have you. You can actually do a pretty good job of erasing them. And I like to give myself a pat on the back for this one, because I think it's pretty hard to see where that particular power line went through. But the concept of using this adjustment layer to actually modify specific regions of an image is extremely powerful.